And we're live. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the SIFWA, the panel. I'm really excited. I've been wanting to do this panel for a long time. I'm Diane Morrison. I'm your host, and we have a great panel of authors that I'm really excited to talk to, and I hope you'll be as excited to hear from them as I am. So let's start with the introductions, and I don't know, let's start with Sam.
Hi. My name is Sam Miller. I'm here because I wrote a novel called Blackfish City, which is sort of a post-climate change future, a floating city in the Arctic where a woman arrives one day with a killer whale on a mission of bloody revenge. And I got a killer whale tattoo to go with it. That's all I got. And I'm terrified of climate change all the time, forever.
And he's not mentioning that, of course, he's won a few awards and had a few award nominations. Congratulations on the Andre Norton Award.
Thank you.
That was pretty awesome. I watched that live, so that was cool.
Awesome. I apologize for the profanity.
You know what? I'm Canadian, and when we're not angry, we say the F word like every third word. So really, it's okay.
Good. My husband felt I used the F-bomb too many times in my acceptance speech.
You did use it a lot. I was impressed. It was cool.
Thanks.
All right, and then we have Matthew.
Hi. So I'm Matthew Kressel. I'm a 3-time Nebula Award nominee and UG Award nominee. I co-host the Fantastic Fiction at KGB Reading Series in Manhattan with Ellen Datlow. So if you're in New York City, you should check it out. We also have a podcast you can listen if you are not in New York. I'm also the creator of the Moksha submission system, which if you've ever submitted to a magazine like Lightspeed or the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction or Uncanny or Strange Horizons, you've used my software. No, I do not have a backdoor to get you accepted. And the reason I'm on this panel is, well, a number of reasons. I've been an environmentalist pretty much my whole life. I've been concerned about climate change for ages and ages. And so I think for me, it was just seeing so much dystopian fiction that I wanted to counter that with some optimistic points of view. So lately, especially in my shorter work, but also in the novel I'm working on, I'm writing what I call mindfully optimistic fiction. And my most recent piece that's out is called The Marsh of Camarina, and that's in an anthology called Shades Within Us.
Fantastic. Yeah. Welcome, and thank you for creating the Moksha submission system. You have made my life much easier. I'm sure lots of us could say that. So.
Well, that's my job, so thank you. I'm glad it worked for you.
All right. And then let's have Laurel.
Hi, I am a semi-retired scientist. I studied water, including toxic substances and the policy of water use and consumption. And, you know, in my lifetime, I actually didn't expect to see the effects of climate change. And I'm a little shocked at how things have really escalated. I am semi-retired as a writing, and one of my genres is dystopian. And I try not to go too far into the depressing end of it. I think all of us need to have hope. And I'm working on a climate fiction trilogy. And the first one of the trilogy is called Surface Tension. And it's in the early stages of the changing of our climate. So that's my history. And I'm excited to be talking with this group.
Welcome. I'm really looking forward to some scientific perspectives on this as well. So this is really cool. Thank you so much for agreeing to be part of the panel.
My pleasure.
And then we have JK.
Hi everyone, I'm JK Ulrich. I'm here because all of my books to date have featured strong climate fiction themes. My debut novel, Blue Karma, won several independent publishing awards for its depiction of a near future drought crisis. And the creepy thing was, for me, I started writing that book in 2014. And not long after that, we had the terrible droughts in California and the wildfires and all these things that were still semi-fictional when I was writing them just seemed to explode all over the news headlines. And that really drove home for me how important this genre is in terms of bringing awareness of climate change to the public. I mean, I spent all of my 30-odd years living on the East Coast in the Mid-Atlantic, and in that time, I've seen things change around me, and it's really an uncanny experience to have. So it's only natural that all of that comes into my work. So I've got 2 titles currently available, both of which have environmental themes, and my 3rd novel, due out next year, takes place in my new hometown of Baltimore, looking at a climate-influenced future as well.
Fantastic. So welcome. This is great. There's so many knowledgeable people. This is going to be so cool. I've tried my hand at this genre too. I wrote a self-published novelette that was the darker side of things. It was a dystopian, post-apocalyptic horror piece that I still don't really know how I feel about it. And I got an honorable mention in the Writers of the Future competition for a solar punk story that I wrote called, it was called The Death of Plastic at the time, and I've changed the title since to The Mysterious Death of Mr. Punk. So, I've dipped my toe in the water. The reason why I thought it was really important to do this, the reason why I've been on this for a couple of months, and it's been difficult to get people together over the summer. I'm probably gonna live and learn with this podcast. I'm probably not gonna do that in the future, but I discovered what nuclear winter is going to look like to some degree this summer, because I live in the Okanagan Valley in Canada, in BC, Canada, and I've seen the effects of climate change over the past several years. But this summer, all the smoke from the Washington fires got trapped in the valleys, and it all came up through the valley. And the newscast kept saying how, it's going to be, 35 Celsius, which is in the 90s Fahrenheit, right? And it's going to be hot and sunny, and it was cold and dark. The temperature was more around 15 Celsius. The sun was a pale red orb. It was, people were going around with surgical masks to breathe, right? This is how it was. And I'm like, okay, now all the trees are turning early. Fall has come early because they did not get enough sunlight, and they therefore think that, okay, based on the amount of sun we've gotten, it's winter now, so we need to change. And I think it's just going to get worse. I see it get worse every year, right? So we need to talk about this, and we need to address it. And I'm really glad that people are writing about it. So I guess the first question I'll throw out there is, why are you drawn to this genre? Why do you feel that this is something you want to write about? And not just anything.
Actually, I'd like to answer that. I'm hearing from all of us that we're experiencing it now, and we shouldn't be, because we had the opportunity to prevent a lot of this, and it's frustrating, and it's very immediate for a lot of us. I just moved to California this spring and haven't seen a drop of water in 5 months. Having moved from Portland, Oregon, that's not abnormal for California, but it's also a little sobering. And like you, we've had an incredible amount of smoke. And I think it's the immediacy, but it's not just that. It's that this is a global potential catastrophe that can really destroy human life at a high level. And the urgency is really there. And this is a shot when we could be doing something about it. And I think that urgency, and sometimes the frustration of reading the news, leaves you kind of speechless. And writing about it, writing stories, kind of helps you overcome the paralysis.
I think it does more than that. I think it overcomes people's tendency to shy away from these things, especially when there's a lot of overwhelming data and statistics involved. And CLAPI serves as a form of narrative data modeling, and it puts all of that science into a context that's very accessible for people and shows them in a very visceral way, these are what your familiar places could look like if this continues. And I think that makes the reality that much more potent for people than just looking at a column of numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I began to be aware of climate change in the late 90s, and I remember trying to talk to people about it, and there was just this overall sense I got of indifference. It was like, oh yeah, that's important. Yeah, we shouldn't pollute. And then the next day they'd go out and buy their, $60,000 SUV that gets 12 miles to the gallon. It was like there was a disconnect with it. And then I started seeing a lot of dystopian fiction. And by the way, I love reading it, and I've written it, so I have nothing against it. But I started to feel like I wanted to see other points of view, because I almost feel like, science fiction has always been in some ways a predictive medium. And if all our visions of the future are bleak, does that then say that our future will be bleak? In other words, like, are we limiting our imagination? So what I wanted to do, at least in my own fiction, was to provide alternate points of view, and to say, like, here's another future that is possible. I'm not saying that this is necessarily going to be the future. I just want to provide, a window into a future that could be possible if we work hard enough to get it. And I think that's really, really all it comes down to for me, is just providing that glimpse into another future, right? Because, the post-scarcity future seems pretty cool if you're in poverty, but a lot of people wouldn't even know that that's a possibility if they didn't read or watch science fiction. So I think, like, not that it's our only goal as science fiction writers or fantasy writers to do this, but for me, I think I find that it helps me deal with the anxieties of the actual world we're in.
Yeah, for me, most of my fiction is me trying to take something that I'm terrified of and trying to become less terrified of it. And so, with looking at climate change and looking at some futuristic scenarios and ways that things are likely to play out, it's there's no scarcity, I don't think, in contemporary science fiction of horrific imaginings of all the ways in which the world is going to get over by rising sea levels and other climate related problems. And that's totally important and valid. For me, what I was kind of interested in with Blackfish City was looking at, okay, we're totally going to get screwed, but how are we gonna? What are we going to be like afterwards? And what are the things that are going to, like, life will still have meaning? People, I don't enjoy the sort of like zombie apocalypse future where it's like, the only reason we're staying alive is in the hopes of forestalling our horrific end another day. So, I want to imagine, okay, if coastal cities have all flooded and there's been these mass migrations of people and wars for resources have further devastated humanity, there might be some real shit too. And people might make new cities and new worlds that are beautiful and exciting and have really good noodles. So, trying to find the silver lining in the nuclear winter cloud.
And that's one of the intriguing things about cli-fi as a genre, is that you don't even have to think of it as a genre. It can be a tool within all other genres. For example, my first book, cli-fi, was the plot for the most part. That was the core of the story. Whereas the project I'm currently working on, the climate elements are much more of a backdrop, and they've become woven into the characters' mundane lives, and it's something that no one really thinks about much, but from a reader's perspective, it's like, wow, how are they getting by in this altered world? So you have the ability to make it as dreary or as hopeful as you like. You can make it as direct or as subtle as you like. It's a very powerful tool in how you can use it to influence your fiction.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I did an interview recently with a lady who is one of the co-founders of a group called the Band of Dystopian Authors and Fans on Facebook, and she was discussing the thing about apocalyptic fiction, right? If you're going to write an apocalypse, right, you're looking for hope. the idea is you want your characters to survive, and despite these apparently insurmountable odds, to do something that is meaningful as humans, right? To, to continue with families and maybe, rebuild a form of civilization and come together, which we tend to do in disasters. And that's something that we discussed too. Statistically, right, all these horrible stories you hear about disasters are nonsense, right? People tend to come together during disasters. Most of the stuff you heard about New Orleans after Katrina and all that stuff is entirely rumors, right? The only thing is, and I don't know, maybe we'll get into that later. I don't know how dark we want to get, but the exception is famine. People will do terrible things in famine, right? But that's it. That's the only thing. So you can see the best side of humanity, and you can also see our worst side. Getting back to what you were saying too about positive looks at things, I like that too. You're right. If we're only writing about the dystopias, then that just increases apathy. People will be, well, we're doomed. What are we going to do, right? But I would rather think, yes, okay, we can develop technologies that give us all the conveniences of life that we are used to and like, and the value of our technology, which does improve quality of life for a lot of people. But at the same time, we don't have to do it in this destructive way. And part of the reason why we're doing that is that there are people who are making a lot of money doing it this way, and they want to keep making money, right? So we can put a stop to that. I don't know if you guys have thoughts on either side of that, the more positive look or the more apocalyptic look, but jump in if you do.
I have found as a scientist, I've given a lot of presentations to the public, and when I just talked about the gloom and doom, they all shut down. And you both have to personalize it, and you have to give people hope, or you've lost them. And, that's one thing that I think Matthew mentioned earlier. We've done enough data dumping on this. What we need to do now, and what fiction can do, is bring it into people's lives. A colleague of mine told me that many years ago, they separated environmentalism from public health issues because they were concerned about the environment not being given the priority that it needed. The problem with that was, I think it disassociated people's connection to the environment, the assumption that we're separate from it. And I think climate, bringing that home, that we are not separate. So in my fiction, I'm exploring, the people's response, both positive and negative. In every disaster, we see positive and we see negative. But that's the thing about writing this, is you get to examine that.
It's a wonderfully subversive tool in that regard. If you go up to a random stranger on the street and start talking to them about climate change and climate science, chances are you're going to get a deeply polarized response.
Yeah.
But if you can tell somebody a good story and put those themes into a compelling narrative that doesn't preach, it just entertains someone and provides a little bit of thoughtful material in that context, I think you give people a much better opportunity to come to those conclusions on their own.
Yeah, and another thing too is I think often I hear that the opposite of dystopia is utopia, and at least in my fiction, first of all, I think utopia is a verb, it's not a noun. I think it's something that you work towards, and I think that if you write fiction that is optimistic in the sense that you're speculating that we figure out a way out of this mess that we're in, doesn't necessarily mean that the way out is going to be easy or without problems. So I think at least in a lot of the fiction I'm working on now is I focus on those particular problems, on how difficult it's going to be to make these changes, even if we do end up making them, and how structurally society is going to change because of that. Hopefully for the better, but I'm like you said previously, there are some very powerful interests who want to maintain the status quo. And so, those people are not going to be happy when we switch to renewable infrastructure.
So my day job is as a community organizer, and so I look at a lot of this through the lens of activism and fighting back against systemic problems. And so, thinking about who's benefiting from the status quo and who's sort of causing the problems that are happening, and not to disregard the accountability that we all have and the role we have in getting a new iPhone or whatever every time one comes out, or whatever we do that's maybe not the best thing for the environment, but that there's also bigger picture systemic things and action that's being blocked and things that could make a difference. And one that is really satisfying to me about reality is the bad guys never get punished. The people who are at the heads of these corporations, they retire with huge severance packages. In the rare events where the asshole politician gets booted out of office, they don't go to jail for horrific crimes, right? They sort of live life. And so one of the things that I rely on fiction for, both as a reader, a consumer, and a writer, is to give that sort of sense of justice and this idea that the guilty can be punished, and the people can be held accountable for their actions, and the people who are benefiting from destroying the planet might actually be brought to account for that.
I'm going to go read your book just for that. I seriously am. I agree with you. I would like to see, one of the things I think we need to make happen, right, is that if we're going to institute these systemic changes, we need to deal with the problems in the system that are creating monkey wrenches, right? And in order to do that, one of the things we have to do is punish people for violating the regulations that exist and not peeling them back, right? Which someone always wants to peel them back. Oh, we can't make money this way, dude. Right? The statistics are that more people are have jobs in green power, right, in just about every field now than they do in oil. It's true in Canada. It's true in Texas, right? It's true everywhere. So that's a flat out lie, and people need to be held accountable. We need to stop doing more than going, oh, you have $1 million fine. It's usually a couple $1,000 fine to companies who pollute, right? When they're making millions. I mean, they're like, yeah, okay, pay it and just keep dumping, right? They don't care. They need to care. And one of the ways in which they're going to care is if we make them care, right?
Well, they don't care because they have such a short-term, myopic view of the world. And we as science fiction writers have the advantage on them there because we're capable of seeing a broader timeline and extrapolating out from those short-term decisions to see what the true impact might be. And we also get the poetic justice satisfaction of happy endings where we can make sure the bad guys pay for what they do, even if that's not really something that happens outside of fiction, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, one thing for me that has always been kind of a disappointment in humanity is that we want to do the right thing, but we often don't. And the reason is always the economics of it. And I think that now that renewable energy and solar and wind and things like that are becoming cheaper than coal and natural gas and nuclear and things like that, the economic incentive to do these things is actually really, really good. And then so you're seeing a massive switch to renewables. And I think we're going to see that with electric vehicles as well. And so I think, an interesting place to put a story is the tension in that economics. And I think that any fiction that deals with climate change is almost always dealing with the economic impact of it.
That's one thing that every study I see on environmental protection, water, it's so much cheaper. It's so much more economical to prevent a problem. For example, air pollution, it saves $20 to $30 for every dollar you spend on regulations, on cleaning it up. And I think it's not about the economics of it. It's about the distortion of the economics of it, that it's really kind of a 1% issue, just like other aspects of our economy. It's the 1% benefiting from the pollution approach, whereas the 99% of us would benefit. from a sustainable approach in our economics. So that's one thing. I love the power of writing because it is frustrating to see these people escape, the consequences of their actions. And you get the power to bring a bit of karma to them in your writing.
I think it's good to have to visualize seeing what that would look like, right? Because I think that coming back to the economics, right? I didn't expect we were going to get into a discussion of economics, but I suppose I should have.
I'm sorry.
No, you're so
love
right.
economics.
Economics are the thing, right? We've got the tension. We're all like, okay, most of us know the world is going to hell and we have to do something. We have to do it quickly. 12 years, apparently, we have before it's irreversible. That's what the latest data says, guys. We have 12 years. Okay, right? And then on the other hand, we have, reasonable economic fear, right? The people who always get screwed the most whenever there's big changes in technology is the poor, right? Because this is something I dealt with in my solar punk story, right? The number one profession right now for men in North America is driving, professional driving, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's taxi driving or driving truck or whatever, right? And we're bringing in automatic cars that will do all the driving for you, yep. Right? So great. Now what are men in the lower income bracket supposed to do to support their families, right? We got to come up with something, right? We have to come up with ways to make these transitions possible without making this huge group of starving people, right? Because when you get this huge group of starving people, there's only one recourse for them, and it involves ropes, right? So we don't want that. I don't want that. I don't want to see a revolution in my lifetime, right? So we need to plan this. And I wish that more of the people who are currently benefiting from the status quo will recognize that they are signing their own death warrants by not dealing with the problem. I don't understand why people can't be a little bit more, have a broader view and realize that if the world is a better place for everybody, it's a better place for you too, right? And I find it very frustrating.
I think it's this sort of fundamental horrible thing, right? Is that the people who are being screwed the hardest by things, not always, but many communities and groups who have been screwed really hard are very susceptible to being brainwashed or to being lied to. And so, you can sort of see the sort of transformation of the United States of the last few years of people who've been hit hard by economic crisis and who are white and who are really the right wing did a really good job of validating their racism and telling them that all they need to do is put a racist in the White House and then all their problems will be solved. And people were like, oh, that's totally what needs to happen. So I think, it's a common thing is that when there's economic injustice and when people are, it doesn't necessarily follow that people are able to analyze the true source of their oppression and organize to effectively fight back against it.
Yeah, I mean, people in power are very, very good at spreading messages that will keep them in power, right? So I think it's our job as storytellers to spread alternative messages and say, this is another possibility. This doesn't have to be this way. And I think that's the power of fiction, is to introduce ideas that the entrenched power may not necessarily like. And it's not that we're necessarily trying to start a revolution. We're just trying to start discussions. At least, I'm not trying to start a revolution, but I think it would be pretty cool if there was a renewable energy revolution.
That is the power of the written word. We can envision and inform people to an alternate reality. One of the things that I've scientist and in my work is that there are people that we will never reach. That I met one man and we had this discussion on how much was enough for him. He just wanted more and more and more wealth. And he finally said, there will never be enough. I will never stop wanting. And I am done trying to convert those folks. What I think we need to do is convert the people or talk to the people and create policies that create jobs for, like you say, all these people who will have another way because of automation in cars and trucks and so forth. So we can, as authors, create worlds where that happens, or at least we can say this is the possibility, and provide a counter story to the lies that are coming from those folks who will never get enough in their pockets.
Sometimes those counter stories aren't entirely fictional. They can just be different perspectives from the contemporary timeline. And that's actually what inspired my first book. Is I'd always lived in a nice suburban water secure area where every time you turn on the tap, the water comes out and you never think about it. And when I was about 17, we got hit with a hurricane and it shut down our water infrastructure for a few days. And suddenly the entire texture of your world and the way you interact with it changes. I can remember so acutely seeing a glass of water that had sat on my nightstand overnight. Normally that's something you would just toss in the sink. But when your taps have stopped working, you look at that like it's full of diamonds. It becomes incredibly valuable because you've changed your perspective. And I think fiction in general, and climate fiction in particular, when we're talking about environment and economics, gives people a glimpse into other people's realities and those alternate narratives that just aren't part of their daily experience, and helps them think, wow, this is somebody else's reality, and it could very easily be mine if things don't change.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know what to say to that, but because I'm, when you're in complete agreement, what else are you going to say, right? Yeah, I think it's important to try to look at these different perspectives and think about things from these different angles. I think most people are aware, right? I think most people are aware. Yes, there's a real problem, right? Yes, we really have to do something.
I don't
and
know.
Nobody knows. You don't agree with it?
Well, because I mean, there's a certain group of people who I've spoken to who just say, "What? How do you really know?" And they're usually a little bit older. I'm Gen X, and they're usually baby boomers, but not always. And they're always sort of like, "But how do you know?" And then I would turn around and I would say, "Look, 99.99% of climate scientists say this is a real thing. It's really happening." And they're like, "Well, how do you know? What about that 1%?" And I said to him, my brother-in-law is a doctor, and I said to him, I said, if 999 doctors said you had cancer and the one doctor said you didn't, who would you believe? And he just, there was this wall there, and it wasn't any wall. And this is what we spoke about before. It wasn't something that anything logical would break. And so I think that, at least for me, I'm not necessarily trying to convince people that don't believe it, because if they don't believe it, they're not going to change their mind. I would say, maybe a percentage, 1% of people are it's possible to change their mind. I don't think it's worth it to focus, our energy on these intransigent people. I think that for the people who do care and who do want to do something, I think important to provide ideas and say, here's a way we might go forward.
I agree. And there's another group of people that I've changed my approach towards. There's a lot of people out there who say, okay, I get it. I'm just overwhelmed. I can't deal with it. And they shut down. And I think that what we can do is put out, one thing that I love the Union of Concerned Scientists for is that they don't say, oh, you should. And they come out with solutions that are almost invisible to most people. It just shifts how they're interacting in the world without them noticing it so much. And that's a way to do it, so that you're not having to convince people or change their behaviors. You just slip in the cars that are green, and you just make it easy.
So there's I think the panelists may be familiar with something called Project Drawdown. Yeah. Which is just like this, I'm sure you could describe it better than I can, but it's just a series of different projects to reduce the world's carbon footprint. And one of the I think it was the top 3, and maybe even been the primary thing that could reduce the world's carbon footprint was education of women. And I thought that was really amazing. Like they just showed very concretely how this was the case. And I think like certain facts like that, showing how the A could lead to B could lead to C is really powerful. and is a much stronger message than, hey, you know, we really should do this or the ice caps are going to melt and the polar bears are going to die. And that really sucks. And I don't want the polar bears to die. But I think, like, you know, something that we can actively do to affect people in our local environment, or at least, you know, our fellow humans, I think is something that really connects with people.
I think we've done ourselves a disservice in our culture by setting up this artificial divide between STEM and the arts. I don't think they're two separate things. They are beautiful partners when done correctly. And I think climate fiction has a unique ability to make that elision happen, because you can take real facts and real information and you can weave it into a narrative so that people can absorb it and approach it, and it makes it that much more accessible to them. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article for The Atlantic about the use of climate fiction books in curricula, in college classrooms, in high school classrooms. And I interviewed some teachers who are using these materials as part of their science education. They would use, you know, Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake to talk about genetic engineering. They would take Kim Stanley Robinson's books to talk about climate impact. And they found that students are more engaged when they have that narrative context, and it brings together aspects of those themes that don't come out of fact sheets. So I think in terms of bringing in that educational aspect you've discussed and making people feel more empowered to understand these problems and take a constructive action, that writing this type of fiction is a good first step.
Yeah, I agree with Matt. In fiction, as on Facebook, I've stopped worrying about having conversations with people who vehemently disagree with me, you know, looking at how do we speak to the folks who are on the same page and to whom we can provide a sort of blueprint for what justice or change could look like. And this is also where I sort of like start to like shift hats into my community organizer hat and, you know, say that, like, you know, I don't remember who said that people feel helpless, right? And that's true. And one of the many things that I love about direct action is it provides a really easy way for folks to do something. And so being in the streets, being in demonstrations, really easy thing that can be really transformative and galvanizing and help provide folks with a way in to get involved and to see that there's a lot more that they can do. So that's just my public service announcement for, like, you know, I love Twitter activism. Twitter activism is great. Real world activism is also really fun.
I think what a lot of us are saying is breaking down the barriers between the facts and the humans. And, you know, a lot of what you were saying, I got involved in writing about 15, 20 years ago because Carl Djerassi, a scientist who won the Nobel Prize for developing birth control from the yam, put a call out to scientists to get fiction to make science more accessible to the public. And, you know, it took me a while to stop being the scientist. Well, not to stop being the scientist, but stop writing like a scientist. And to break down that barrier between the STEM and the creative. I think that that's really vital, both in terms of us as creators, but also in terms of reaching the public.
Yeah, I love that idea. And actually, I'm sure you've heard that, you know, the SpaceX Dragon capsule, they're going to launch the Japanese billionaire around the moon, and Yusaku Maezawa. And he said that, you know, he wants to have 5 other artists with him. So it's not going to be like, you know, 6 scientists in the capsule, in the Dragon capsule, the SpaceX going around the room. It's going to be 6 artists. And I just find that so beautiful and such a brilliant PR thing, because, you know, they're like, everyone's going to be like, oh, I wonder what they're going to be inspired to do or to make or to create after this. And then they're going to come back and they're going to do it. And maybe in 6 months or a year or even less, when they come back with, you know, music or a painting or you know, a work of fiction, and people see this, they're going to be, wow, that's so cool. And so, yeah, like this artificial division between, you know, the STEM and the arts, I think, is something that I think that we can intentionally break down. So I don't know. I find that stuff super inspiring.
I sort of come at it from a reverse angle from Laurel, right? I'm not a scientist, but I sure love to read about science. And I think I have an ability to understand a lot of things that maybe a lot of regular people like myself don't, right? Because I read a lot about it, right? So I want to go to people like you, right? And I want to hear what it is that you have to say. And then I'm going to try to translate it to the best of my ability, right? And reach people. The people I want to reach are the people who are going, okay, yes, I recognize there's a problem, but I don't know what to do about it, and I'm afraid of losing my job, right? That's the people I want to reach. It doesn't have to be, okay, you're going to lose your job if we stop digging up oil in Alberta, right? We have a whole shit ton of prairies out there, and there are thousands of kilometers of places we can put wind turbines, and they work. You know, I've seen lots of them. I've driven across Canada a couple times, and I've seen them, and they're beautiful, and we can do it. Yes, they've got their own problems. You know, people make a big deal about the birds tend to get caught up in them. Yes, okay, we're going to have to figure out something to deal with that. But there's always going to be these other little unintended consequences, and a choice for me between, okay, this way lies destruction and death for sure, and this way maybe we live. I'm here, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, so how do you like to approach your fiction? What is it that you're trying to communicate primarily when you sit down to write about climate change and its effects on us and how we can deal with it?
Well,
I thought it was interesting
go ahead.
that, after you.
Oh no, I'm sorry. There's a little delay. You go first.
All right, I thought it was interesting that Sam talked about bringing his work as a community organizer to his fiction, because I do the same thing, but kind of from a different angle. I work in the technology field, and I inadvertently bring some of that to my writing, because while Laurel started out as a scientist and moved towards being a writer, I have an English degree, but I ended up in the technology field and discovered that my seemingly useless liberal arts degree was really good at taking, you know, abstract technical data and putting it into a context that lay people can understand. So when I'm coming up with stories and building these climate fiction narratives, I look at it in the same way that I do something like, you know, technology analysis. You know, I identify a variable, whether that's, you know, a water crisis or sea level rise or something like that, and you kind of run a simulation and you say, what can I extrapolate from that variable? What does that scenario look like? And then you start to build a narrative around that. You put people in that situation and see how they behave, and before you know it, you've got an entire novel blossoming out of that one variable.
Yeah, I think you know, it depends on the particular piece that I'm working on, but I think I work in some ways like Sam in the sense that I identify something that gives me anxiety, and I know myself when I'm afraid of something, then I become obsessive about learning everything I can about it. And so like I'll research it and I'll dig into it, and I think like if I'm talking about a specific aspect, you know, maybe how climate change will affect us, or you know, on the novel I'm working on, it's about emergent AI and how this will affect us. I basically start with that fear and then just dig and dig and dig until I don't necessarily try to preach with my fiction. I find that if I'm reading a book and I sense that there's some kind of hidden message that I'm supposed to get, I kind of become resistant to that a little bit. But instead, what I do is, you know, I explore it and try to find my way through it until I find like a path through the darkness, so to speak. And it's kind of like when you shine the light on the darkness, things become a little less scary. So, like I said, every piece of fiction that I work on is a little bit different, but that's kind of generally where I work from.
About 20 years ago, I did a mid-career change. I'd been doing research, which is mostly the accumulation of data, and you end every paper with needs more data. And it's just like, okay, when do I get to do something about this? So I went back and got a master's in policy because honestly, I don't care about data. I care about the people. And I also shifted to public health and away from looking at the environment, not because fish, I really do. But what drives my writing, I have found, is I put human beings in really impossible situations, and it's them that intrigues me. And my stories come from them, and that whole pseudo barrier between the humanities and science is so artificial because it's the people that drives us. That's where my stories come from, is really caring about them and letting them march through this hellscape I've put them into.
Yeah, for me, it's always something different. Every story or bigger project comes from someplace else. And often it is, something scares me and I want to understand it better, or I'm really excited about this thing, or, oh my God, I just learned about this thing that happened in history that nobody knows about. And let me put it in the future so I can pretend I invented it. So it's always something different. But I do want to, I was just thinking as folks were talking about, writing with a message and whether we're writing to change minds or not. One of the things that Holly Black, one of my favorite writers, was my Clarion instructor. She said that if you have something to say, if you want to argue a political point in fiction, you almost have to argue the opposite of it. Because if you write a story about how being an anti-immigrant jerk is a bad thing, and you just say that on page 1 and on every page after that, then people who are anti-immigrant jerks are not going to read it. And people who are not that will read it and get down with it. But if you present someone's humanity and you present someone who might have beliefs that you find reprehensible, and you sort of give them a certain degree of respect and space so that readers, wherever they stand on the issue, can connect to that humanity and to the complexity of the human, where we might think that, oh, here's somebody who's a really good mom, but also a homophobic jerk. And so we can see that kind of complexity and then hopefully take them on a journey as a character that maybe readers will also follow them through, of like, okay, well, maybe think about how beliefs that we have consequences for us, and how maybe you act differently, you will not have these problems that are being caused by your own ignorance, kind of thing.
I don't think any reader wants to pick up a story that has an obvious agenda. They're going to take that as an insult. But if we can approach the story from a more neutral standpoint, as you say, it gives them opportunities to interact in kind of a safe test environment. And yeah, I had a thought there and it completely evaporated, so.
You'll think about it to 2 o'clock in the morning. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I like that. I think you've got a point there, or rather your instructor did, Sam. Yeah, she's right, or he's right. I don't even know if Holly Black is male or female. I'm familiar with the books, but no idea. But yeah.
Oh, I remember that point. I was going to say that in that regard, fiction actually has an unusual advantage over nonfiction writing, because when you're doing a nonfiction piece, I think it's inevitable that you come to it with some kind of bias and you want to convey some kind of message, whereas fiction can act as that more neutral terrain and provide thought space for people instead. It gives it unique power.
Yeah, I was just having this conversation with Lilian Rivera, who's an amazing writer who just published this great piece yesterday about Hurricane Maria and its impact on Puerto Rico. And the idea that when you're writing in fiction, even if you have to grind, you're hiding it behind fictional selves. So even if people, no one's going to come at you about the X you had to grind in your story. Okay, that's not true. Someone totally will, but not as many people. Whereas if you write a short story, an essay or a nonfiction piece, you're nothing to hide behind. It's like, this is what I think, this is what I believe, this is what I want to communicate to you. And so that tends to be much scarier for me anyway, and much more of a likelihood that you'll get a high volume of jerks telling you
The
about
trolls will
yourself.
come for you.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think also it gives people less opportunity to discuss it. If you just lay out a body of facts, it is what it is. Whereas if you put together a fictional narrative, people can spend hours debating what they think different things mean or interpreting the themes that they read into it. And it forces a lot more cognitive interaction with that subject matter, which is really valuable when you want people to think seriously about these issues.
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying there, right? Like, yeah, if you
We've all
presented,
spent hours and hours discussing our favorite fan theories about TV shows and books, but you read a news article, go, huh, that's cool, and then you move on to the next thing in your life, right?
Well, I mean, doesn't that make, I mean, I'm agreeing with you in the sense that, like, I think that having a compelling antagonist who challenges the protagonist's ideas, and if the protagonist eventually wins by sheer force of argument, I think that, like, strengthens your own argument, right? So if you're just going to come to the page with a, you know, an argument already won, well, that's like much harder to sort of have a, you know, compelling argument to people. But if you have this, you know, dialogue and say, well, what about this? And have you considered this? And what about that? And have you considered that? And then at the end of it, if the reader can come out saying, oh, wow, I'm much more informed about the subject, and I also agree with it much more strongly than I did when I go in, I think that's more successful than just sort of declaring, you know, your point of view by fiat, you know?
or you start with a protagonist who's on the opposite side of the issue from what you're eventually trying to convey, and they work over to the side of the fence that, you know, ultimately is the conclusion you've drawn. As long as you're, you know, as long as you love your protagonist and you're treating them like a human being through the whole thing, then I think that can be really powerful.
I think too, as an author, I can get very angry at people who are denying facts, quote unquote. But some of the characters that I write are actually people who are good people, heroic and wrong, and are leading others in the wrong direction to bad effect. And it's not that I'm taking it out on them, but it gives me to examine people from the other side and humanize them in my own mind. So it's not just for the readers that writing is powerful, it's also for me, I would say.
And that's a really interesting point, because I know that I, for my own part, have a lot more compassion for people in fiction than I ever do in real life. And that's a big personal feeling on my part. But everyone talks about how toxic the public discourse is today. And if you can bring a little more empathy to that conversation through fiction, that is something that we desperately need more of in our lives right now.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a point where you have to accept there's going to be no middle ground, right? The talk of civility, right, in the public discourse, I find frustrating, because I tend to find that it favors whatever the status quo is, right? Because it's easier to denounce someone for being rude when they're not in the status quo, right? And some things, in my opinion, just require flat out, listen, you're wrong and you're a jerk, right? And that's it, right? There's some things you're never going to win, right? And so, yeah, there's no point in trying to convince them anymore. And but we can get to a point where we can respectfully disagree, I think, right? If the other side is willing to do that, right? Sometimes they're not. You know, the minute someone starts with stupid libtards, we're done, right? I have nothing to say to you. Go away, right? But if you're like, listen, I think you're mistaken because this is my information, okay, I'll listen to you. Maybe we can, you know, I may not agree with you at the end of the conversation, but at least you're not making it about me. You're making it about your point of view. And that's cool.
You know,
Personalizing that conversation too, because everyone does get so passionate and so personally invested in these topics wherever they stand, that you can kind of remove it from yourself by putting it in a fictional context. But I think it also gives an opportunity for common ground, because no matter who you are, human beings like stories. I think it's genetically encoded in us somewhere. So if you have a good story, regardless of whatever else it may be about, people will find something to engage with there, and it gives us a place to start a larger conversation.
I think stories give someone the ability to walk in someone else's shoes. I remember hearing of a white supremacist that a judge told him he had to, as part of his punishment, walk in the world as a black man. And I don't really know how they pulled it off, but they did. After spending some time having people react to him as though he was black, got a bird's eye view of how awful it was. And he came around. I saw him interviewed. And I think the power of fiction is to give people a safe place to walk in other shoes and you know, break down that antipathy that we feel.
Well, we're nearly at the hour mark here, guys. Is there anything that you want to discuss that we have not brought up yet? This has ended up being more about the nature of what we're writing than the writing process. And I don't have any issue with that. That's cool. Cyberpunk, the conversation was like that too, right? So, but is there anything you think we should be discussing that you'd like to put out there?
Just out of curiosity, my fellow authors, what is the one aspect of climate change that either frightens you the most or you think will be the most impactful in the near future?
I think it's probably going to be sea level rise. So has any of the panelists read 2140 by Kim Stanley Robinson? So I live in New York City, and I think Sam experienced this. Were you here for Sandy? You were here for Sandy, Sam. Yeah. So it's like, it was basically like this. It was, you know, a mini apocalypse in New York City. I mean, the subway shut down. There was no gasoline. It was just, but like, people held together, but there was a tension in the air, and it was very palpable and very unsettling to realize how dependent we are upon this, you know, million-year-old black substance, and how quickly the whole situation can degrade without it. And so, you know, for me, it's you know, seeing that it's the fear of climate change affecting, you know, things like the weather and sea level rise. I mean, I think I'm at like maybe 10 feet above sea level. I've seen, you know, during that storm, the water came within inches of my parents' house. I've had friends that lost their houses because of it. My cousin lost his house because of it. Some family heirlooms. So, like, you know, Kim Stanley Robinson talks about how basically everybody just ignored the warnings of climate change, and the sea level came up to basically 23rd Street in Manhattan, and everything below that was basically underwater. And it was just this terribly frightening thing. But what was so frightening about it was just how he described the fact that everyone was warned, everyone knew this was going to happen, and they were like, eh. And that to me is the scariest thing, is this indifference. So I think with my work, I'm trying to, you know, not in everything I write, but in a lot of things I write, I'm trying to, you know, attack that indifference.
I read this great book called Slow Apocalypse by John Varley, right, where he was talking all about that. Just suddenly all the oil just went away and how everything fell apart, right? The rising sea levels may have happened before, right? People who are all like, oh, well, you know, climate change has happened before, and it might be a natural thing. My answer to that is, so what, right? So what? Maybe it did. And you know what? All those cities are still underwater. And we know that there's a whole bunch of technology that's been lost because divers, archaeological divers, have been digging it up, right? We know that there's been, you know, all kinds of information that we'll never see again. So even if it has happened before, so what? Shouldn't we be doing whatever we can to, like, you know, minimize it at the very least, right? For me, famine, that's the scary part. Remember how I was saying, right? You read the data and people come together in disasters. No, they don't in famine, right? In famine, they will kill their own children, right? They will do it. Like people just go crazy. I don't know if it's like that it's because it's such a primal fear that we have, but we turn into animals, right? And this is a big effect that people don't think about when they think about climate change, I find. They think about, okay, yeah, all right, so half of New York's going to be underwater. So what? Okay, well, half of all the growing land we have in the world is going to be underwater. What are you going to do then? Right? If fires burn up the entire West Coast, which it seems like they're in danger of doing, it fires here every year since 2011, right? We're a major agricultural area, right? We grow a lot of fruit here, right? Every year, the cherry crop is ruined by a hailstorm. The apple crop is ruined by a late storm in the fall. If it grows at all, because it doesn't have enough water to grow. What are we going to do when there's not enough food to eat? That's my big concern.
I would say this there have never been plus billion people on the planet when these other scenarios were in place. And feeding people, getting people safe water. This is one thing that we say in the water world is there's enough water for everyone. It's just not distributed to everyone. And this is where humanity and how people behave comes into play. So in my writing, that's what interests me most is like, we can, for the most part, survive. Could survive if we came together, and that's the hard part, that coming together thing. There are always wonderful people who make amazing things to bring people together, and then there are the ones who do the opposite. So that's what intrigues me as a writer. That's what scares me as a human being and as a scientist, is how we will take care of 7+ billion people as this shifts. But on a good note, there are good people. It will never be all gloom and doom. We can start a new colony inland. Theoretically, that's it. But the numbers of environmental refugees that we're looking at as this thing progresses that's what terrifies me.
Yeah, for me, my big concern is looking at the ways that our existing problems will be made worse as climate change continues to impact us. So, for example, here in New York City, we got a great subway system that has been underfunded for decades and is going to shit. And so, when Hurricane Sandy hit, one of the things that happened was some tunnels experienced flooding or damage, and now entire major subway line is going to go out of commission for like a year and a half so that repairs can be done because the sort of infrastructure is not where it is. So here's cities suddenly becoming less livable in like right now, like not 10 to 12 years in the future, like right now, looking at the ways that, you look at it on the macro level societally and like, as people are, like I mentioned before, as people are getting hungrier, as jobs are getting scarcer, as existing industries are being told, like people get desperate and they do crazy shit, like elect a fucking tick. Sorry. JK, what about you?
I would agree with water. Not number 2 would be the sea level rise and the floods, because I think that is going to be a drastic challenge, but also the scarcity of it. And not only because it was a topic of my first novel, but because in the course of researching that novel, I gained an entirely new appreciation for how underappreciated that resource is, especially for those of us in Western regions that are water secure, and we've never really had a concern with turning on the tap. But our bodies are 70% water. Our lives can't continue for more than a few days without water. And all of the climate models suggest that desertification will only accelerate. So I think once we realize how that precious resource is slipping away, that will be the cause of all kinds of conflicts in the future. And that is one of the things that scares me the most about climate change.
Well, we're pretty cavalier about our water. You know, we throw all kinds of plastic into it. We think it's just going to disappear. We're learning that's not the case, right? You know, things like here in BC, we are apparently selling a good part of our water to Nestle for pennies, right?
Doing the
But-
same thing in Arizona and the U.S. too.
Right? Yeah, and then the cost of household water goes up by exponential amounts every year. Why are
And
we not
The
charging?
problem is people have had it for free for so long. It costs pennies, so it's something that you waste without thinking about it. And if you had to pay for gas pay for water the way that you pay for gas for your car, people would value it a lot more highly.
I have to say, I did a project in Abu Dhabi, and it was about conserving, because the vast majority of their water is desalinated water. But if the power goes off, their water is gone, and they have people living in a desert. There are no streams. There is no potable groundwater. And the shock of how desperate that situation would become very quickly if they didn't have power was really sobering to me, as someone who has always lived in water abundant or at least reasonable areas. So yeah, water is the thing that scares me. Very, very access to it, to safe water.
I think you've got a point too, Sam, about how, you know, we're starting to see the changes now. Things that are problems becoming bigger problems. And this isn't something that we're passing off to our children to deal with. This is going to be our problem, right? My city for the past 3 years has been a construction nightmare, right? Because every summer, for the brief period between the massive flood that has begun every spring and the cold, the early rainy fall, that, you know, where we have like the smoke filling the sky and the week of sunshine on either end, right? During that time, right, the city's dug up, right? And the reason why is because we're replacing all the water mains. And the reason why we're replacing all the water mains is because we had a big flood that caused a sinkhole in the middle of our major highway like a couple of years ago, right? And it made international news, right? I saw the hole, you know? So yeah, there's an example, right? There's one of these things like the subway, right? So, you know, they went, oh crap, we better do something because we don't have enough infrastructure to handle this kind of flooding. And they didn't. They were all backed up into the street. It was running down the main street. It was terrible.
The next time you have to write a climate fiction story about the impact of that sinkhole and give people advance warning so that they can do something about it before it happens.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right then, if anybody else has anything they'd like to discuss, otherwise, I'll just ask you guys, what have you got coming up in the near future in terms of your work, appearances, etc., that you would like the audience to know about?
So I have a story that I co-wrote with author Mercurio de Rivera called The Walk to Distant Suns that will be appearing in a future issue of Analog.
And it's a brilliant story.
Thank you, by the way. So I saw the page proofs for it, but I don't know exactly what date it's coming out yet. And I'm going to be moderating a panel on the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy at New York Comic Con. That's the one that N.K. Jemisin edited. So I'm really excited to get to moderate that panel, to ask all these amazing questions. And yeah.
Fantastic.
I have a story called It Was Saturday Night, I Guess That Makes It All Right, which is in the new anthology by John Joseph Adams called A People's Future of the United States. And my third novel, Destroy All Monsters, will come out in June from Harper Teen.
I'm in the process of revising my third novel, which is never a fun activity, but I'm really excited to share it with everyone, hopefully middle of next year. And I'm definitely more of a novelist than a short fiction person. Short stories are anathema to me. So I'm really proud to say that I just won my first award for a short story. I can't say which one yet because they've prohibited me from saying something before they make the announcement, but that will be awarded next weekend. So check out my social media feeds to find out more about that.
Congrats.
Congrats.
Awesome. Good for you.
Congrats.
Thanks.
I'm wrapping up revision on my first climate novel, sci-fi novel, and I had to break it into 3. I tried to put it all in one, and that didn't work. So I'm working on the first in a trilogy. The second thing is I'll be on a panel at Oricon coming up in November on science and fiction.
Awesome. I just kickstarted a collection that is a serial novel called Once Upon a Time in the Weird West, and it is available now in paperback and will be coming out in hardcover probably in October. And I'm going to have a story in Terra Tara Terror from Third Flatiron, which will be appearing on September 30th.
Huh?
So, yeah. Thank you so much, everybody.
Well,
This
thank
was
you, Diane.
lots of fun.
Yeah,
Thank
this
you
is
so
you.
much. It was great. Thank you.
I hope to have any of you back, anytime if something else comes up that is a subject that interests you.
say the word.
Awesome. Check out their work, guys, and we will have at least one link to contact them online, either their website or social media link in the video description when I am done the notes, but you have to give me a couple hours to get that done.
Keep writing.
Take care.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
bye, everybody. Thank you so
Bye.
much.